You talk about your own behavior that is as repugnant as that you ascribe to President Trump. What were some of the things that you did on his behalf that brought you shame?
Well, virtually everything that I was tasked to do. The more that I wrote about it, the more I realized that I had lost my moral compass. And, in the book, obviously, I described Mr. Trump as a cult leader.
In his memoir, Disloyal, Michael Cohen says his boss of 12 years was a cheat, a liar, a fraud, who falsely manipulated his company's true worth.
Yes, I was actually a party to that. One of the reasons that we were doing it is because Mr. Trump wanted to be higher in the Forbes 500 list. And the way to do it, he would just come up with a number. He'd say, I'm worth $8 billion. I'm worth $10 billion.
Satisfying Mr. Trump's obsession with winning at any cost, Cohen says he once paid an expert to artificially boost his boss's rank in an online poll of top business leaders.
He was able to create an algorithm for me that for every vote that went to somebody else, 2 or 3 votes went for Trump. I asked Mr. Trump, what number would you like to be? So he goes, well, I want to be number 1.
The White House has blasted Cohen's book as fan fiction, saying Cohen readily admits to lying routinely, but expects people to believe him now so that he can make money from book sales. It's unfortunate that the media is exploiting this sad and desperate man to attack President Trump.
People will approach this book and at the fact you were convicted for lying to Congress and question your entire credibility. And to that you say what?
Yes, I've made my mistakes and I have owned them publicly. And I cannot make anybody believe me. All I can do is to make amends with my family and with the country and to tell the truth.
New York federal prosecutors acknowledge Cohen did provide information to law enforcement, including the special counsel's office, but also noted that Cohen's description of those efforts is overstated in some respects and incomplete in others.
You called Trump a racist. Were you witness to any moments that you thought he was exhibiting racism or used a racial slur?
Yeah, unfortunately, all too many times. When we were in Chicago, we were driving through a predominantly black neighborhood, and his comment to me was only the blacks could live this way.
In his book, Cohen says there were really no words to describe Trump's hatred and contempt for Barack Hussein Obama.
Well, I believe that his hatred for Barack Obama just basically starts with the fact that he's black and that he was the first black president in this country.
After then-President Obama mocked Donald Trump at the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner, Cohen says his boss wanted him to publicly deny that he was upset.
Lester, not only did it bother him, it really irritated him.
On Russia, Cohen writes, the campaign was far too chaotic and incompetent to actually conspire with the Russian government. But Mr. Trump himself, he says, was hedging his post-election bets, trying to nudge a proposed Trump Tower Moscow project along during the campaign and praising Putin.
Do the Russians have some kind of a financial hold on Donald Trump that you're aware of?
Well, that's something that they'll have to figure out based upon his tax returns and the investigation into Deutsche Bank. But the answer to that is no, I'm not aware of any of that.
Cohen writes the last time he spoke to President Trump was in 2018.
If you had a conversation with Donald Trump right now, what would you want to tell him?
I would tell him he should resign now. Let Mike Pence pardon you from any and all potential crimes that will come out against you. And that would be my recommendation to you. Step aside.
Cohen was released to home confinement to serve out his sentence. He was briefly sent back to prison in what a judge later ruled was government retaliation related to his book release. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.